Salam, micro-orientation. This part is part 59, Unknown-Unknown Detection Heuristics. Its job is to tell us, calmly, clearly, when we have reached the edge of our current framework. Why is this necessary? Because without this function, science breaks in two terrible ways: denial and mythology. Denial forces new phenomena into old categories until the data becomes distorted. Mythology invents new things to patch gaps and then calls those inventions knowledge. The skill you will gain today is the disciplined sentence, outside scope. You will learn how to say that sentence with evidence, not emotion, with order, not panic, with humility, not surrender. Concept definition. In Holophase, an unknown is not magic and not a mysterious label. It is an operational diagnosis. It means, within our current firewall, using all admissible families of rules, we cannot produce a stable, licensed description of what is happening. In other words, our rule space is too small to close the ledger. We are not failing to try. We are succeeding in proving that our current search space cannot earn a license here. That is why it is a detection heuristic. It is not a prophecy about reality. It is a test about our method. To ground this, we speak a small equation in audio form. We write phi of x and t. That means phi as a function of position and time. In plain words, the phase depends on where you are and when you look. From that, the triunity is always together. Omega is the time rhythm of phi, the rate of cycling. K is the spatial structure of phi, the patterning across space. V is motion and propagation, how those patterns move, couple, and transform, built from both time change and space change. Sometimes it helps to say the derivatives out loud once. We can say omega is d phi dt, meaning the change of phi per change of time. And k is grad phi, meaning how phi changes as you move through space. Then V is the way the pattern travels when both changes work together. You do not need to do calculus in your head. You only need the meaning. Omega is timing, K is structure, V is propagation. And the firewall always tests them together, never as separate stages. Why this is necessary? Episode 11 is the episode that keeps science sane. It does not ask, what is the universe made of? It asks, how do we keep false rules from surviving? A civilization can lose reality in two ways, by overreach or by surrender. Overreach is when we keep stretching a rule beyond its license, adding patches and exceptions, until falsification becomes impossible. Surrender is when we call a hard problem beyond science and stop testing. Unknown-Unknown detection is the engineered middle. We keep testing, but we also know when our tests have reached the boundary of what they can honestly certify. Now I will state our signature axiom clearly. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. And when a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. This is the firewall. Unknown-Unknown. Heuristics apply this axiom to the boundary itself, to the moment when not just one candidate rule fails, but our whole way of searching begins to wobble. Formal meaning in Holophase terms. In normal work, we test a candidate grammar against data from license windows. A license window is a segment of observation that meets coherence and calibration requirements, so we can responsibly compare rule predictions to what was measured. If the window is not licensed, the firewall treats it like an unverified witness. Interesting, but not admissible in court. Unknown-Unknown detection is not triggered by one surprise witness. It is triggered by a structured, repeatable pattern of failure across many witnesses, many windows, and many instruments, even after disciplined upgrades. Holophase names 4 frame failure signatures. I will explain each in plain language, then tie it back to omega, k, and v. Signature 1. Persistent reconstruction instability. This is when you try to reconstruct the underlying phi pattern from data, and the reconstruction refuses to settle. Imagine you keep taking clear photos, but the object's shape keeps changing in your reconstruction. Not because the object changes, but because the inference never stabilizes. Operationally, different reasonable analysis choices, window boundaries, sampling rates, filters, coordinate choices, lead to different best stories. And none of those stories becomes dominant as data quality improves. There is a simple way to hear this as an audio listener. If a rule is real and within scope, then when you gather more good data, your estimate should tighten. Your plus or minus should shrink. But in reconstruction instability, the plus or minus refuses to shrink. The story keeps sliding. It is like trying to tune a radio. You turn the knob and you get one station. You turn it slightly and you get a completely different station. And even when you buy a better radio, the knob still lands on different stations depending on tiny choices. How does this look in triunity? You may stabilize omega only by destroying k, or stabilize k only by destroying v, or stabilize v only by losing omega. The picture stabilizes in one shadow, but collapses in another. The firewall marks this as a potential frame signal, because within scope, we expect the 3 shadows to become more consistent together, not to trade stability like a zero-sum game. Signature 2. Exhaustion of admissible families. The firewall does not allow every imaginable rule. It maintains a registry of admissible grammar families. Families that stay within phi and its derivatives, obey scope discipline, and can be licensed. Exhaustion happens when you systematically test all admissible families that could plausibly cover the domain, and none can earn a license. This does not mean we haven't found the right genius yet. It means, under our current metagrammar, there is no candidate family that can survive the firewall in this regime. To keep this simple, picture a keyring. Each key is a family of allowed rules. When a door will not open, you try the keys. If one key works, the door is not a cosmic mystery. You just needed the right key. Exhaustion means you tried all keys on the ring and none turns. That is when you stop blaming your hands and ask whether you are standing at a different kind of door. Unknown-Unknown Detection does not claim the door is supernatural. It claims our current keyring is insufficient. How does this look in triunity? Across different families, you see the same kind of joint breakdown. They can fit timing, but then mispredict structure. They can fit structure, but then mispredict propagation. They can fit propagation, but then violate temporal persistence. Different rules fail, but the failure shape repeats. That repetition is information. The failure is not just in one equation. It may be in the allowed space of equations. Signature 3. Repeated trilog breakdown across all upgrades. This is the strongest signal, and it must be joint. You upgrade instruments, you upgrade calibration, you change sampling, you change sensors, you change window regimes, and still omega, k, and v refuse to lock together in a coherent, licensable story. Say it with a concrete picture. You build a setup that measures omega with stunning clarity. The rhythm looks perfect. But now your spatial picture becomes smeared. K becomes unreliable. You sharpen K with better spatial resolution, and now V becomes inconsistent. Propagation looks like it changes depending on how you look. You track V with a clever propagation estimator, and now omega becomes ambiguous. Timing coherence collapses. You attempt a joint measurement, and the results contradict each other, not randomly, but in a patterned way that repeats across windows. This is why we call it a trilock. A healthy framework lets the three lock together. Better omega helps you predict better V. Better K helps you interpret better omega, and so on. When the lock refuses across systematic upgrades, the firewall takes notice. The strongest unknown signal is not something odd happened. It is, no matter how we try to make time, space, and motion cohere together, they refuse, across any licensed window and any admissible family. Signature 4. Contradiction patterns that do not localize to scope. In normal science, contradictions tell you where a rule's scope should be narrowed. This rule works at low speed but fails at high speed. The boundary is localizable. In an unknown domain, contradictions are non-local. They appear in many corners of omega kV space, and they refuse to be quarantined. You cannot say, it's only here. The contradiction behaves like a global tension in the framework. A simple example. You do two protocols that should be equivalent, and you get behavior A in one and not A in the other. And you cannot find a scope boundary that explains the difference. You look for hidden assumptions: temperature, geometry, timing offsets, sensor drift. You correct them. The contradiction persists. That is not proof of magic. It is a signal that our current equivalence rules, our assumptions about what counts as same conditions, may be incomplete. Now we must speak about energy, because energy is where humans most quickly slip into mythology. In Holophase, energy is tally only. It is accounting. It is a ledger that tracks constraint satisfaction across omega, K, and V. It is never a substance, never a hidden fluid, never a magical cause. In unknown situations, energy tallies become non-stabilizable in consistent ways. You compute the ledger, and it will not close. You compute it again with improved measurements, and it still will not close. You compute it with a different admissible rule family, and it still will not close. The mistake people make is to turn this into a new ontology. A mystery energy is appearing. Holophase forbids that. The correct interpretation is, the ledger cannot close because the rule space is insufficient. Here is a short everyday analogy, and then we exit it. If you try to balance your budget using only cash receipts, but many transactions are digital, your ledger will look broken. The fix is not to invent ghost money as a substance. The fix is to admit your accounting model is missing a category, then upgrade the accounting rules and check again. In the same way, when energy tallies cannot be stabilized, we do not invent a new substance. We diagnose that our current ledger rules are incomplete here. Let's pause and make one subtle point simple. An unknown is not the same as we don't understand yet. Plenty of things are hard while still being inside scope. Inside scope means you can improve the story by improving one of three things: your omega handling, your K handling, or your V handling. Maybe your timing is sloppy and you need better synchronization. Maybe your spatial representation is too crude and you need better boundary modeling. Maybe your propagation model is missing a coupling term, and once you include it, the trilock stabilizes. Those are hard problems, but they're not unknown. Unknown is when the entire improvement ladder fails to stabilize the joint story. Now we add one more audio equation that helps the listener keep the triunity joint. We sometimes write a simple coherence check like this: omega, K, and V must agree with each other. In other traditions, people write V equals omega over K, but here we treat it as a coherence test, not a sacred formula. Spoken plainly, it means If your timing rhythm and your spatial pattern are both real, then the propagation you infer must be compatible with both. If omega says the rhythm is fast and k says the pattern is wide, then v cannot behave like a slow crawl. If omega says the rhythm is slow and k says the pattern is tight, then v cannot behave like an instant teleport. When your inferred v keeps disagreeing with omega and k, no matter what you do, the trilock is signaling frame trouble. Let's talk about false alarms, because an honest firewall also protects us from crying outside scope too early. The most common false alarm is a window problem. A window can look coherent, but still be misleading if it is too short, too narrow, or contaminated by a hidden drift. Another false alarm is a pipeline problem. Two teams may use different preprocessing that accidentally creates different reconstructions. In Holophase, before we declare unknown-unknown, we require pipeline independence tests. Different teams must be able to follow different legitimate pipelines and still agree on what fails and how it fails. If they cannot, the problem might be the pipeline, not reality. This is why the crisis protocol includes archiving and governance. Archiving is not just storage, it is protection against self-deception. When every attempt is recorded, we can later see whether we were honestly exhausting possibilities or quietly steering toward our favorite conclusion. Operational interpretation. The crisis protocol at the audit gate. When a team suspects an unknown, the firewall does not convene to speculate. It initiates a structured diagnostic siege. This siege has three simple goals. First, prove that this is not a normal rule failure. Second, prove that this is not merely a missing capability. Third, if the failure persists, declare scope breach and preserve the evidence so framework expansion stays disciplined. Before the steps, imagine the audit gate scene for a moment. The council does not ask, "What do you feel?" The council asks, "What did you test?" The council asks, "Show us the windows." It asks, "Show us the coherence licensing." It asks, "Show us how omega, k, and v fail together." It asks, "Show us that you did not change definitions midstream." This is not bureaucracy. It is how we stop mythology from wearing a lab coat. In Holophase, proof is not a vibe. Proof is a record. Step 1 is siege testing. We select the strongest admissible families and run them through a battery of tests in the new domain using multiple licensed windows. We do not allow cherry-picked success. We ask, can any candidate earn a license that survives falsification, variation, and independence? If not, we map the failure signatures. Where does reconstruction instability spike, and how does trilock break? Does omega fail first, or does k fail first, or does v fail first? Does the order rotate with context? If the order rotates while the overall failure remains, that is another clue that the framework is missing a joint closure mechanism in this regime. Step 2 is representation and sensor exhaustion. We change representation. Time domain, frequency domain, multi-scale summaries, and structural summaries. Anything that is allowed without changing ontology. We also change sensor channels. If we have been measuring with one kind of phase comparator, we try another kind. If we have been using one instrument family, we try a fundamentally different one. The question is simple. Does the failure shape persist across representations and sensors? Here is the key decision point. If a new channel suddenly stabilizes reconstruction and restores trilock coherence, then it was not unknown. It was a missing capability. We lacked an appropriate way to see the phenomenon. That is good news. We update the firewall, add the channel, and move on. But if every channel, every representation, every careful window regime produces the same structured failure, then we are learning something deeper. Our current admissible rule space may be too small. Step 3 is the forbidden step. Do not smuggle primitives. During a crisis, the temptation is to invent a new entity, a new force, a new metaphysical ingredient. Holophase forbids this as an immediate response. Instead, we do three actions: declare scope breach, archive attempts, and open new model class proposals under governance. Declare scope breach means we issue a formal notice that the current license framework cannot responsibly describe this domain. This is not a statement that reality is irrational. It is a statement about our current tools. Archive attempts means we store every failed grammar, every unstable reconstruction, every trilog breakdown with full metadata. These are not trash, they are boundary markers. Open new model class proposals under governance means we invite proposals for new admissible families, but we keep them under the same firewall discipline: clear definitions, test plans, falsifiers, and strict scope claims. Now, what does open new model class proposals under governance actually mean in simple language? It means we allow new candidate families to be proposed, but we do not allow them to enter as beliefs. They enter as testable drafts. Each proposal must state in plain terms what it changes and what it does not change. It must stay within the Holophase ontology, phi and its derivatives only. It must state how omega, k, and v are handled jointly. It must state what would falsify it, not someday, but operationally. What measurements would force it to be narrowed, downgraded, or retired. It must also state what new predictions it makes that the old families could not make. Governance requires back translation. New families must reduce to old ones where they worked. We also require what I will call the minimum change rule. When a scope breach is declared, the goal is not to rewrite the entire universe. The goal is to expand the admissible space just enough to capture the new regime and no more. Why? Because every new degree of freedom is also a new opportunity for unfalsifiable storytelling. Minimal expansion keeps the firewall tight. Firewall role. What failure does this mechanism block? It blocks three forms of collapse. First, it blocks scope laundering, pretending a rule works everywhere by quietly changing definitions. Second, it blocks epicycle spirals, adding patches until falsification becomes impossible. Third, it blocks mythology, introducing untestable primitives and calling them explanation. Unknown-Unknown Detection keeps the firewall honest by forcing a clear boundary between what is licensed and what is not yet licensable. Now we state the signature axiom again, because it must be reinforced. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. And when a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. Unknown-Unknown Heuristics are the courage to apply this even when the failure threatens our pride. Prediction. Here is the explicit prediction for a true unknown-unknown, stated plainly and tied to triunity. If we are truly outside the frame, then every attempt to rescue the rule via representation changes, sensor changes, and window upgrades should fail in the same structured way, producing repeatable failure signatures. That means reconstruction instability remains high, admissible families remain exhausted, and omega, k, and v refuse to cohere together across any licensed window, even as measurement precision improves. Not random failure, but the same recognizable failure shape, repeating like a fingerprint. Falsification and license consequence. Here is the falsification condition. If a single upgrade, such as a new sensor channel, a new window regime, or the admission of one new admissible family, resolves the issue and restores trilog coherence, then it was not an unknown-unknown. It was a missing capability or a missed assumption. In that case, the firewall action is not scope breach, it is framework update. We formalize the upgrade, update licensing criteria, and archive the episode as a case study in how the firewall learned. We do not dramatize it as beyond science. We treat it as science doing its job. So what is allowed, what is forbidden, and what happens? What is allowed? You are allowed to declare a potential unknown, but only with diagnostic evidence. You must present the failure signatures, show that you attempted siege testing, show that you exhausted representations and sensors, and show that the triunity joint failure persists. A declaration without this is not discipline, it is drama. What is forbidden? You may not label the phenomenon supernatural or beyond science at first difficulty. You may not introduce new ontological primitives as an immediate patch. You may not continue to apply old grammars in a domain where a scope breach has been declared, as if repetition will convert failure into truth. And you may not rewrite the ledger. If tallies change, you must explain the change as a method issue, not as a new substance. What happens? The firewall enforces frontier discipline. A confirmed frame failure triggers a scope breach notice, archives all attempts, and opens governed proposals for new model classes. A resolved crisis triggers a firewall update, not a mythology celebration. Either way, the community gains a disciplined record of what happened and why. Let me give one restrained historical analogy, and then I will exit it quickly. Before quantum mechanics, classical families faced black body radiation, the photoelectric effect, and atomic spectra. Within the classical admissible space, the ledger could not close. The failures were structured, repeatable, and cross-laboratory. A mature firewall would have treated this as a scope breach at that frontier, archived the failure signatures, and governed the search for a new admissible family. When quantum families arrived, they did not erase the old story. They explained why the old families worked where they worked and why they failed where they failed. That is the ideal: continuity plus correction, not mythology plus amnesia. Now I will restate the skill again, because it is emotionally hard. The discipline sentence, outside scope, feels like defeat to an ego, but it is victory for the method. It is the sentence that prevents us from lying to ourselves. It is the sentence that keeps the archive clean. And it is the sentence that allows the next generation to approach the frontier with clear eyes, not with inherited mythology. To close the concept with a final compact checklist, here are the questions you ask before you say outside scope. 1. Did we license the windows properly, with coherent timing, clear structure, and stable propagation estimators? 2. Did we run siege testing across multiple admissible families, and do they fail with the same signature? 3. Did we change representations and sensor channels, and does the failure persist? 4. Does the trilog still break, meaning omega, k, and v refuse to cohere to one stable story? If those answers are yes, then outside scope is not a mood. It is a conclusion. Closing summary and bridge. Today we defined unknown detection heuristics as operational tests for frame failure, persistent reconstruction instability, exhaustion of admissible families, repeated trilog breakdown across upgrades, and contradiction patterns that do not localize to scope. We anchored the strongest signal in triunity, omega, k, and v, refusing to cohere across any licensed window. We demoted energy to tally and explained the correct reading of unstable tallies. The ledger cannot close because the rule space is insufficient. And we described the crisis protocol: siege testing, representation and sensor exhaustion, and then a disciplined scope breach with archiving and governed proposals. Peace be upon you.